At 3:47 in the morning, I didn't catch my husband cheating loudly. I uncovered a system, a hotel mirror selfie, a parted white robe, and 5 words cold enough to kill a marriage. Room 412, still warm. What I found next was worse than betrayal. This woman didn't just sleep with married men. She built her legacy by turning them into puppets, burying the truth beneath prestige, charity, and promotions. My name is Camilla Knight. I am 37 years old, and for the past decade, my life has been defined by the meticulous pursuit of liability. As a litigation attorney in Philadelphia specializing in severe corporate negligence and workplace misconduct, my days are built on a simple, unshakable premise. People will always lie, but their paper trails do not. I have cross-examined executives who smiled warmly while perjuring themselves, and I have dismantled entire corporate narratives with a single misdated email. I am trained to look at the wreckage of human behavior, strip away the emotion, and extract the facts. It was exactly 3:47 in the morning when I finally turned the key in the lock of our brownstone. I had spent the last 18 hours in a windowless conference room, buried under thousands of pages of discovery for an upcoming trial. My eyes burned. The house was wrapped in that heavy, unnatural quiet that only exists in the absolute dead of night. I slipped off my heels in the foyer, craving nothing but a hot shower and the dark oblivion of sleep. I pushed the bedroom door open. The room was dark, save for the blue-white glow of a street lamp slicing through the blinds. On the bed, my husband, Nolan Pierce, was fast asleep. He was lying on his back, breathing in a slow, rhythmic cadence. He was still wearing his crisp, pale blue work shirt, the collar undone, the cuffs rolled up to his forearms. It was a strange, jarring sight. Nolan was meticulous about his routines. Seeing him passed out in his office clothes made him look like a man who had grown so accustomed to living two separate lives that he no longer bothered to change costumes between them. I walked toward my side of the bed. As I reached out to turn on the bedside lamp, the screen of Nolan's phone, resting face up on the nightstand, flared to life. It was a silent notification. Just a sudden burst of harsh light in the dark room. I did not mean to snoop, but my eyes naturally dropped to the source of the glare. The lock screen displayed a photo preview, accompanied by a brief line of text. The image was a mirror selfie taken in a sterile, upscale hotel bathroom. The subject was a woman, her face partially obscured by the angle of the phone, but her posture was unmistakable. She was wearing a thick white hotel robe, parted just enough down the center to suggest that there was absolutely nothing underneath it. Below the image, the text message read, "Room 412, still warm. Come back if you miss good judgment." The sender's name was not hidden behind a fake moniker or a discreet initial. It sat there, glaring in bold letters. Meredith Vale. Meredith Vale, Nolan's direct supervisor. The chief operating officer of Vale Meridian Logistics, a third-generation family shipping empire with a stranglehold on the eastern seaboard. A woman whose face frequently graced the covers of local business magazines, heralded as a pioneer of corporate leadership and a highly visible champion of philanthropic legacy. Any other wife might have shattered in that exact second. I could have screamed. I could have ripped the blankets off the bed, hurled the heavy phone against the drywall, and demanded answers from the man groggy and blinking in the sudden chaos. I could have let the hot, blinding rush of betrayal tear through my chest and dictate my next, fatal move. But I did not cry. I did not wake him. I did not move a single muscle for a long, heavy minute. Instead, the wife in me stepped back into the shadows, and the litigator stepped forward. The shock metastasized into absolute, icy clarity. I was no longer standing in my bedroom looking at my husband's phone. I was standing at a crime scene, and I was looking at Exhibit A. I picked up the device. It was warm in my palm. Nolan had changed his passcode several times over the last year, claiming security protocols for work. But people are fundamentally lazy creatures of habit. When under pressure, they revert to muscle memory. I swiped up on the screen and typed in a 6-digit code we had shared years ago. Back when we were newlyweds struggling to pay off law school loans. The phone unlocked. I opened the messaging application. I did not have to scroll far to find the active thread with Meredith. What I found was not a momentary lapse in judgment or a drunken one-night stand. It was a meticulously documented timeline of betrayal stretching back over 8 solid months. My thumb moved over the screen, swiping backward through time. I read the exchanges with the cold detachment of a medical examiner performing an autopsy. There were the expected clichés, the illicit photographs, the late-night flirtations, the coordinated calendars mapping out afternoon hotel rendezvous disguised as client meetings or off-site strategy sessions. But as I kept reading, the texture of the conversation began to subtly, dangerously shift. It was not just an affair. The language was entirely wrong. Between the hotel room numbers and the emojis were chilling, coded corporate directives. They discussed the approval package for a new fleet contract right after finalizing plans for a weekend in Boston. There were casual, demanding mentions of a legacy night gala, intertwined with complaints about an evaluation that had been adjusted after hours. The boundaries between Meredith's sexual dominance and her corporate authority were non-existent. They were one and the same. She was not just sleeping with my husband, she was directing him. She was moving him like a piece on a board. Then, I hit a message dated 3 weeks prior. It was a response from Meredith after Nolan had expressed some anxiety about the risk they were taking, about the possibility of being exposed. Her reply was a single devastating text. Married men are always easier. They protect the wrong thing first. I stopped breathing. The light from the screen reflected in my eyes, but the words burned themselves into my brain. Married men are always easier. They protect the wrong thing first. In that single, sharp sentence, the entire landscape of this betrayal shifted. This was not about love, or lust, or even a desperate midlife crisis. This was a calculated, operational methodology. Meredith Vale was not just a woman having an affair with a subordinate. She was a predator operating with a distinct corporate philosophy. She chose Nolan not because he was irresistible, but because he was compromised. He had a wife, a mortgage, a public image to uphold. He had something to lose. And by pulling him into her bed, she had manufactured the ultimate leverage to control his pen in the boardroom. I realized, with a sickening drop in my stomach, that this was no ordinary infidelity. It was a hostile acquisition. My hands moved swiftly. I could not risk Nolan waking up and wiping the device. I initiated a screen recording. I went through the entire thread, scrolling smoothly so every word, every image, every timestamp was captured in high resolution. I opened his work email app and cross-referenced the dates of the hotel stays with his travel itineraries. I opened his personal finance application and found the digital receipts. He had been covering his tracks well, but not well enough for a forensic eye. There were cash withdrawals, padded expense reports, missing gaps in time that now perfectly aligned with Meredith's dictatorial schedule. I bundled the screen recordings, the screenshots, and the financial anomalies. I created an encrypted folder and forwarded the entire package to a secure, private server I maintained exclusively for highly sensitive case files. I then went into his outbox, deleted the sent emails, and emptied the digital trash. I scrubbed the device clean, leaving absolutely no footprint of my presence. I checked the battery percentage. It was at 42%. Exactly where it would be if it had been sitting idle for a few hours. I placed the phone back on the nightstand, precisely in the same spot, at the exact same angle it had been when I walked into the room. Nolan shifted in his sleep, letting out a soft sigh, completely unaware that his entire reality had just been downloaded, cataloged, and secured by the woman he thought he was successfully deceiving. I backed out of the bedroom and closed the door without making a single sound. I walked down the dark hallway and descended the stairs to the kitchen. The hardwood floor was freezing against my bare feet. I did not turn on the lights. I sat down at the granite island, the shadows wrapping around me. The silence of the house was no longer comforting. It was suffocating. The life I thought I had, the marriage I thought I was building, had been an elaborate stage play funded by a woman I had never met. My chest felt tight, a physical ache radiating from my ribs. but my mind was operating at a terrifying, relentless speed. The anger was there, a dark, pulsing undercurrent, but I refused to let it control me. Anger makes you sloppy. Anger makes you scream in the middle of the night and demand answers from a liar who will only feed you more desperate lies. I needed facts. I needed the full, unredacted picture. Meredith Vale's text message echoed in the dark kitchen. She thought married men were easier because they protected their marriages first, at the expense of their integrity, their careers, their souls. She thought she had him trapped. She thought she had me permanently neutralized by my own domestic ignorance. She had severely underestimated who she was dealing with. Sitting alone in the dark, watching the first faint hints of dawn begin to bleed through the kitchen windows, I made my first unalterable decision. There would be no confrontation tomorrow morning. There would be no tears, no demands for couples therapy, no dramatic ultimatums thrown across the breakfast table. I would smile. I would pour Nolan his coffee. I would kiss him goodbye when he left for work. I would not face him until I knew exactly what I was facing. I needed to know if I was simply destroying a cheating husband, or if I was about to dismantle an entire corrupt power structure. And until I had the blueprints of Meredith Vale's empire in my hands, I would be the perfect, blind, loving wife. Hindsight is a remarkably clear lens, but only if you are willing to look through it without flinching. For several months prior to that night, the subtle tectonic shifts in Nolan's behavior had been quietly accumulating. There were the regional conferences that suddenly required an extra night of attendance due to supposedly critical networking breakfasts. There were the discretionary bonuses that appeared with alarming frequency, always explained away as the result of exceeding quarterly performance metrics. There was the faint, lingering scent of an unfamiliar, expensive botanical perfume clinging to the fabric of his suits when he returned from late meetings. And perhaps most glaringly, there was his new, almost religious obsession with placing his mobile device screen-side down on every single surface in our home. A different woman might have hired a private investigator to follow him to a dimly lit restaurant or a boutique hotel lobby. A different woman might have let the corrosive acid of emotional jealousy dictate her actions. But I am a litigator. I inhabit a world governed by the strict rules of evidence. In my profession, intuition is a completely worthless commodity unless it serves as a direct compass pointing toward admissible documentation. I do not care about whispers or suspicions. I care about the paper trail. Within 48 hours of that initial discovery in our bedroom, I quietly assembled my own private counsel. I bypassed the standard matrimonial lawyers and went straight to the specialists who dismantle corporate fraud. I secretly retained Joanna Reed, a ruthless forensic accountant who had spent a decade untangling complex offshore financial webs for elite private intelligence firms. Alongside her, I hired Miles Avery, a digital forensics expert whose non-disclosure agreements were as unbreakable as his data extraction methodologies. I paid their substantial retainers in full from an independent trust account Nolan had absolutely no knowledge of. Joanna was the first to strike a functional vein of evidence. It took her exactly 72 hours to map the hidden topography of my husband's shadow economy. Nolan had covertly opened a secondary, high-yield investment account under a convoluted holding name. Over the span of 8 months, he had been systematically siphoning funds from our joint savings and diversified portfolios. It was a slow, methodical bleed, designed to evade the automatic alerts of standard banking algorithms. He moved a few $1,000s here, a few $100s there, but the aggregate sum was staggering. He had drained enough capital to single-handedly finance extravagant weekend excursions, exorbitant luxury gifts, and a series of opaque, untraceable payments that his standard executive compensation package could never logically support. While Joanna followed the money, Miles operated in the silent, ghostly realm of deleted digital history. He recognized immediately that targeting Nolan's primary physical device was too risky and ultimately unnecessary. Instead, Miles bypassed the phone completely and targeted the orphaned data backups floating in the encrypted strata of the cloud. What he eventually retrieved from the digital ether fundamentally shifted the temperature of the investigation. Sitting in Miles's sterile, windowless office, I watched as he pulled up a recovered image file that had been permanently deleted from all active servers over 2 years prior. When the image rendered on his high-definition monitor, a cold wave of genuine horror washed over me. It was the exact same hotel bathroom mirror. It was the exact same parted white terrycloth robe. It was the exact same calculated, provocative angle. And nestled beneath the image was the exact same chilling directive. Room 412. Still warm. Come back if you miss good judgment. But the metadata told a different story. This photograph was not sent to my husband. It had been transmitted to an entirely different contact, another senior executive within the logistics firm, exactly 3 years ago. The realization hit me with the blunt force of a physical blow. This was not a unique, passionate affair. It was a template. Joanna immediately pivoted her financial algorithms to cross-reference Nolan's hidden windfalls with the broader operational data of Vail Meridian Logistics. She demanded access to public vendor contracts and state logistics registries. Within a week, she uncovered a terrifying, undeniable symmetry. Every single time Nolan received a sudden internal stock bonus or a mysterious bump in his discretionary funding, a very specific, mid-sized subcontractor named Red Morrow Carriers miraculously received highly favorable, anomalous scoring on their operational bids. The margins on these bids were blatantly manipulated. Standard compliance checks were bypassed or completely ignored. Red Morrow Carriers was consistently awarded lucrative distribution routes, despite presenting higher operational costs and lower safety ratings than their direct competitors. I began to see the massive, invisible architecture of the scheme. Meredith Vail was not simply engaging in reckless workplace romances with her subordinates. She was running a highly sophisticated extortion ring disguised as executive mentorship. I dug deep into the publicly available corporate filings regarding the Vail Leadership Fellowship, a prestigious internal fast-track program that served as Meredith's highly publicized pet project. The historical rosters revealed a demographic anomaly that was mathematically impossible to attribute to chance. For 5 consecutive years, Meredith had personally sponsored and mentored a select group of candidates for this fellowship. Every single one of them was a middle management male. Every single one of them was highly ambitious. And every single one of them was married. It was a targeted selection pool far too precise to be a coincidence. She was actively hunting. She selected men who were hungry for corporate advancement but heavily burdened by domestic anchors. A married man with a mortgage, a family, and a public reputation is a vulnerable man. If you compromise him, if you successfully entangle him in a clandestine sexual affair, you do not just gain a lover, you gain absolute, unbreakable leverage. You own his silence. The true, suffocating horror of my husband's situation was no longer the simple, ugly fact that he was sharing a bed with his boss. The horror lay in the absolute certainty that he had been methodically dragged into signing off on fraudulent financial authorizations and manipulated vendor contracts that he no longer had any power to control. He was an accessory. Meredith had weaponized his infidelity, turning his own guilt into the very chains that bound him to her corporate corruption. The picture was finally complete. A standard divorce proceeding would only punish Nolan, leaving him financially ruined and professionally disgraced. It would leave Meredith Vail entirely untouched, free to continue cultivating her prestige, free to find her next married puppet. I realized that if I wanted a truly calm, devastating retribution, I had to look past the bedroom and aim directly for the boardroom. I had to destroy the one thing Meredith Vail valued above all human connection. I had to annihilate her legacy. I had to dismantle the flawless, philanthropic, brilliant corporate heir image she had so carefully constructed using the power, the money, and the quiet, desperate shame of the men she controlled. I was no longer a wife investigating a cheating husband. I was a litigator preparing a lethal indictment against a predator. Joanna did not stop at current accounts. She expanded her forensic perimeter, dragging a digital net through 9 years of corporate filings, severance packages, and restructuring announcements. The parent conglomerate and its recently swallowed subsidiaries had generated mountains of paperwork, but Joanna was hunting for a specific ghost in the machine. What she dragged up from the deep was a graveyard of ruined careers. Every time a specific operational irregularity was buried, a body had to be left behind to guard it. My accountant found a chilling statistical cluster. Meredith's name was the absolute constant, hovering like a grim reaper over a highly specific demographic of sudden, quiet, voluntary resignations. The pattern was so mathematically perfect it felt less like a corporate coincidence and more like a ritualistic sacrifice. I needed to put a human face to the data points. Data tells you how the machine operates, but testimony tells you how it breaks the bones inside it. I spent 3 days utilizing my law firm's skipped trace databases to locate a woman named Maren Collier. She lived 2 states away now, working as an independent freelance consultant, having severed all ties with the corporate logistics world. Her ex-husband had once been heralded as the undeniable rising star of the Eastern Division. He was the golden boy, until he was not. In the span of exactly 6 months, his trajectory completely inverted. He resigned without notice, liquidated his equity, and the marriage imploded shortly after. When I finally sat across from Maren in a sterile, brightly lit coffee shop booth, I did not offer her a sympathetic hand to hold. I did not ask her about the emotional devastation of infidelity. I laid out a timeline. Maren's eyes hardened as she looked at the dates I had charted. She did not cry. She simply recited a sequence of events that sounded like a perfectly rehearsed, haunting echo of my own current reality. Maren described the sudden influx of late-night text messages disguised as urgent strategic updates. She detailed the exclusive leadership coaching retreats that always seemed to require booking a single, remote boutique hotel far off the main highway. There were the expensive, unprompted gifts, the intoxicating promises of rapid promotion to the executive suite, and then, Maren explained, the velvet trap snapped shut. Once the emotional and physical hooks were firmly set deep in the flesh, her husband was casually instructed to bypass standard procurement protocols. He began rubber-stamping vendor approvals that blatantly violated the company internal compliance guidelines. The promotion was the bait. The signature was the hook. Maren was merely the first layer of the archaeology. She pointed me toward Elise Farrow, another ex-wife who had been left holding the ash of a burned-down marriage. Elise's story was the darker, more violent evolution of the exact same virus. Her former spouse had not just been coerced into signing bad contracts, he had been systematically designated as the sacrificial lamb. When an unexpected internal audit threatened to expose a massive discrepancy in the regional shipping budget, Meredith needed a firewall. Elise's husband was presented with a devastating ultimatum. He was forced to formally confess to gross negligence, absorbing the entirety of the blame to keep Meredith's immaculate, celebrated reputation completely spotless before the board of directors. Neither Maren nor Elise had been offered the dignity of justice, nor even the cold comfort of public vindication. The conglomerate did not protect the whistleblowers or the collateral victims. Instead, they deployed their legal department to sanitize the wreckage with terrifying efficiency. Both women, entangled in the messy, agonizing process of divorcing disgraced men, had been approached with aggressive, undeniable settlement offers. They were handed substantial sums of hush money wrapped in ironclad, punitive non-disclosure agreements. They were paid to quietly pack up their lives, swallow their trauma, and disappear, leaving the architect of their misery firmly entrenched in the penthouse suite, entirely untouched. The sheer scale of the sociopathy was suffocating. I was staring at a map of a serial killer's dumping ground. Only the weapon of choice was corporate policy and human frailty. Late on a Tuesday evening, while cross-referencing Elise's settlement dates with Vale Meridian's quarterly reports, a notification chimed on my encrypted server. It was an anonymous email routed through a secure, offshore proxy. The body of the message contained no attachments, no polite greetings, and no signature block. It held only 2 sentences. It was never about sex. It was about signatures. It took my digital specialist less than 4 hours to trace the origin of the proxy. the sender was not a disgruntled ex-lover or a rival board member looking for leverage. It was Tessa Rowan. She was the executive assistant who had sat directly outside Meredith's reinforced mahogany door for 11 years. Tessa was the invisible gatekeeper, the woman who booked the flights, managed the calendar, ordered the gifts, and quietly observed the destruction from ground zero. She had simply known too much, for too long, to continue pretending she was blind to the slaughter happening right across her desk. The weight of her complicity had finally fractured her silence. I arranged a secure meeting with Tessa. She was a woman completely devoid of illusions, her posture rigid with years of guarded secrets. She laid out the exact, brutal mechanics of Meredith's methodology. The affair was never the ultimate goal. It was merely the acquisition phase of an asset. Meredith actively cultivated an intense, intoxicating emotional dependence in her targets. She made them feel seen, valued, and chosen above all others. Once they were firmly trapped in the intoxicating delusion of a powerful romance, she began sliding the fraudulent approvals across their desks. It started small, Tessa explained. A minor deviation here, a rushed signature there, always framed as a temporary necessity for the greater good of the company. But the moment they hesitated, the moment the men realized they were committing corporate fraud and tried to pull back, the velvet rope instantly turned into a noose. The illicit relationship was immediately weaponized. It became the leash. Meredith did not need to scream or threaten violence. The implication was always clear. Comply. Sign the documents, take the fall, or your wife, your children, and your community will see every photograph, every text, and every hotel receipt. She held their entire lives hostage with a single click of a send button. Sitting in the silence of my home office, reviewing Tessa's notes, the final piece of the architecture locked into place, I realized that the towering, celebrated legacy Meredith Vale had built had absolutely nothing to do with her logistical genius, her operational acumen, or her highly publicized business instincts. Her entire empire was a monument to psychological extortion. She possessed a terrifying, almost surgical ability to identify a man's ambition, manufacture a compromising situation, and then distill his resulting personal shame into a highly effective management tool. She managed through terror disguised as passion. At that exact moment, the fundamental nature of my war completely shifted. The narrative I was living was no longer a domestic tragedy about a wife discovering her husband betraying her. That was too small, too ordinary, too pathetic. What I was looking at was a woman witnessing a multi-million-dollar empire built entirely upon a foundation of systematic predation and soft coercion. My husband was merely the latest brick in a wall built with the bones of ruined men. And I was no longer interested in filing for divorce. I was going to tear the entire structure down to the bedrock. I waited exactly 5 days. 5 days of pouring his morning coffee, asking about his daily commute, and sleeping rigidly on the extreme edge of our mattress, so our limbs would not accidentally brush in the dark. Behind the flawless mask of domestic normalcy, I was constructing a guillotine. I drafted the initial separation agreements myself, stripping out the emotional language, leaving only the cold, hard mechanics of asset division. I collated every single piece of data Joanna and Miles had unearthed, organizing the exhibits into a heavy black leather binder, tabbed and indexed just like a federal trial dossier. It was a Thursday evening when the trap finally sprang. Nolan walked through the front door, loosening his silk tie, bitterly complaining about the endless gridlock on the interstate. He headed straight for the kitchen island to pour his customary glass of expensive bourbon. I was already seated at the formal dining table. The room was dark except for the low, modern chandelier casting a harsh, highly focused pool of light directly onto the black binder resting squarely in front of me. He noticed the severe shift in the atmospheric pressure immediately. He stopped dead in his tracks, the heavy crystal glass hovering halfway to his mouth. I looked at him across the wide expanse of polished mahogany. I kept my voice entirely devoid of inflection, a flat, clinical baritone. I know about Meredith Vale. I also know about Red Morrow. the instinctual reactions of a cornered liar are profoundly predictable. First came the blank, wide-eyed stare of calculated confusion. He let out a breathless, patronizing chuckle, slowly setting the glass down on the marble counter. He asked me what on earth I was talking about, claiming the intense fatigue of a long work week was making me paranoid. He tried to cross the room to touch my shoulder. I simply held up one hand, a silent command that stopped him cold. When I did not react to his feigned ignorance, he shifted seamlessly to minimization. He suggested I had wildly misread an innocent professional dynamic, stating that Meredith was just a highly demanding executive and Red Morrow was simply a standard logistics vendor requiring extra oversight. I did not interrupt his pathetic monologue. I did not ask a single question. In a deposition, questions imply that the floor is open for debate. Instead, I opened the binder. I began to read the facts into the record. I read the exact dates and room numbers of the boutique hotels. I read the precise dollar amounts he had methodically bled from our joint investment accounts to secretly fund his clandestine shadow portfolio. I slid the high-resolution, color-printed transcripts of his deleted text messages across the smooth wood, stopping them right at his fingertips. Then, I pulled out the fatal corporate data. I laid out the internal evaluation sheet side by side, pointing a manicured finger to the digital timestamps, proving the contractor's scores for Red Morrow had been manually altered by his login credentials hours after the official vendor portal had closed. I matched those exact dates to the vesting schedule of his sudden, anomalous internal stock bonuses. Nolan stopped talking completely. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving a sickly ashen gray pallor behind. The bourbon sat untouched, the ice slowly melting. He looked down at the devastating paper trail, then up at me, desperately searching for a trace of the emotional, weeping wife he thought he could easily manipulate. He found nothing but a hostile litigator examining a deeply compromised witness. His posture physically collapsed. The rigid, arrogant defensive shell cracked into a dozen pieces, and the truth spilled out in a pathetic, hurried rush of whispered words. He confessed that the physical affair had been active for 8 consecutive months. It had started innocently enough, he claimed, disguised as private, off-site mentoring dinners specifically meant to groom him for the upcoming senior vice presidency vacancy. The expensive wine flowed, the professional boundaries intentionally blurred, and her calculated flattery intoxicated him long before they ever reached a hotel room. But then he gave me the one missing piece of the puzzle I had not fully cemented on my own, the confession that permanently sealed his fate. He admitted that Meredith had explicitly forced him to backdate a series of critical compliance forms. Red Morrow Carriers was not just a random, lucky subcontractor. It was a dummy shell entity with direct, heavily disguised familial ties to the Vale family trust. Nolan leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table, his voice cracking. He was desperately trying to reframe himself as a tragic casualty of war. He swore to me that he initially thought the first altered document was merely a minor technical adjustment, a standard bureaucratic shortcut to expedite a delayed shipment. By the time he realized the staggering, criminal scale of the fraud, it was too late. Meredith had subtly, smilingly reminded him of the explicit digital trail they shared. She manipulated his blinding hunger for corporate elevation while simultaneously holding a loaded gun to the back of his head, explicitly threatening to detonate his marriage and his pristine public reputation if he refused to sign the next batch of fraudulent approvals. He looked at me with red, pleading eyes. He wanted absolution. He wanted me to view him as a helpless hostage who had been psychologically broken by a master manipulator. I refused to grant him the comforting luxury of total victimhood. Being manipulated explains your cowardice, I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy air and dismantling his pathetic narrative. It explains why you were terrified of her wrath, but it absolutely does not erase the fact that you actively chose to betray this marriage. It does not erase your staggering, selfish greed. And it certainly does not excuse the fact that you stole our shared financial security to buy expensive gifts for the woman actively holding your leash. He flinched violently, as if physically struck across the jaw. I closed the heavy binder. The resounding thud echoed sharply in the silent dining room. I reached into a crisp manila envelope and extracted the formal separation agreement, placing a heavy silver pen neatly beside the signature line. I am not interested in fighting about broken vows or hurt feelings right now, I told him, locking my eyes onto his. I am giving you two choices. You can sign this document tonight, pack a bag, leave this house, and agree to cooperate fully as my star witness when I inevitably bring this entire corrupt structure crashing down. If you do that, I will use my legal expertise to ensure you survive the impending federal fallout with a tiny shred of your liberty intact. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it became unbearable, forcing him to absorb the absolute, crushing gravity of the moment. Or, I continued softly, the words landing like stones, you can refuse. You can walk out that front door right now and stand entirely alone when Meredith Vale decides the heat is getting too high. Because she will inevitably pin every single fraudulent signature, every missing dollar, and every illegally altered contract directly onto your chest. She will burn you alive to save her precious legacy, and I promise you, I will not lift a single finger to put out the fire. The choice was no choice at all. Nolan stared at the legal paperwork for a long, agonizing time. His breathing was shallow and ragged. His hands were shaking violently when he finally picked up the silver pen and signed his name on the dotted line, legally severing our lives. The following morning, the sky was a bruised, heavy shade of gray. I stood quietly by the front window of the living room, holding a warm mug of black coffee, watching as Nolan dragged his rolling suitcase down the front steps toward his idling car. His shoulders were slumped, his gait heavy and entirely defeated. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. He was a man utterly stripped of his grand illusions. As he loaded his heavy luggage into the trunk, he paused and looked back at the house one last time. In that brief, pathetic, lingering glance, I knew the most horrifying realization had finally crystallized in his mind. He finally understood the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of his own ruin. Meredith Vale had never chosen him because of an uncontrollable, passionate love affair. She had never looked across a boardroom table and found his intellect or charm irresistible. She had selected him for one specific, highly clinical reason. He was exactly the type of man she required to run her machine. He was morally weak, he was blindly ambitious, and above all else, he was the perfect, entirely expendable pawn to sacrifice when the board demanded blood. Exactly 72 hours after my soon-to-be ex-husband dragged his heavy suitcase down our front steps, my personal cellular phone vibrated across the glass surface of my office desk. The screen displayed an incoming call from a private, untraceable exchange. I let the device vibrate exactly 4 times before I pressed the green icon and lifted it to my ear. I did not say a word. I simply waited. Camilla! The voice on the other end of the line was entirely devoid of hesitation. It was remarkably smooth, perfectly modulated, and chillingly calm. It was the distinct timbre of a woman who had spent her entire adult life extinguishing massive corporate fires before her morning coffee. Meredith, I replied, keeping my own vocal cords completely relaxed. There was no awkward clearing of the throat, no feigned apologies, and absolutely no pretense of guilt. Meredith Vale bypassed the standard social pleasantries and immediately attempted to seize control of the narrative framing. She spoke to me not as a homewrecker addressing a betrayed spouse, but as a senior executive managing a minor, slightly irritating public relations liability. I understand that you are currently operating under a significant emotional deficit, Meredith began, her tone dripping with a highly weaponized, patronizing sympathy. Discovering your husband's indiscretions is undoubtedly traumatic. However, I am calling because it has come to my attention that you are attempting to project his aggressive, unsolicited professional and personal pursuits onto me. Nolan has always been a highly erratic, overzealous subordinate. I tolerated his boundary issues for the sake of his career development, but clearly, he has spun a wildly inaccurate fantasy to justify his own moral failings to his wife. It was a brilliant sociopathic pivot. In less than 60 seconds, She had completely rewritten history. She was casting herself as the exhausted mentor and framing my husband as a delusional stalker. More importantly, she was attempting to shrink me into a perfectly manageable, easily dismissed stereotype: the hysterical, emotionally unstable wife lashing out blindly in her grief. I did not take the bait. I did not raise my voice or defend my husband's character. Your legal counsel must charge an exorbitant hourly rate to draft fiction of that caliber, I said, my voice dropping an octave into the absolute dead center of professional hostility. Meredith paused. The silence stretched for 3 seconds. When she spoke again, the faux sympathy had entirely evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating edge of a predator evaluating a sudden obstacle. Let us be pragmatic, Camila, she stated, shifting instantly from psychological manipulation to raw, transactional power. Marriages dissolve every single day. It is an unfortunate statistic. I have no interest in seeing a fellow professional dragged through a protracted, expensive, and deeply public domestic relations court battle. I am prepared to authorize a comprehensive private settlement package this afternoon. It will include a sum sufficient to entirely clear the remaining balance on your residential mortgage, cover the absolute highest retainer fees for the most aggressive divorce attorneys in Philadelphia, and provide a very comfortable financial cushion for your transition into a single life. She took a slow, measured breath before delivering the final condition. This is, of course, entirely contingent upon your immediate execution of a standard, mutual non-disclosure agreement covering all parties involved, extending to any and all proprietary business operations you believe you may have accidentally encountered. She was trying to buy my silence with my own stolen dignity. She genuinely believed that every single human being had a precise monetary breaking point. I am declining your offer, I replied immediately. Furthermore, I strongly suggest you review your internal corporate code of conduct, specifically the clauses regarding coercive superior-subordinate relationships. While you are doing that, you might also want to consult your white-collar criminal defense team regarding the fraudulent cash flows and the severely manipulated vendor bidding files surrounding your favorite subcontractor. Have a pleasant afternoon. I terminated the connection before she could draw breath for a rebuttal. Meredith did not retaliate with a second phone call. She retaliated with institutional violence. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, the senior managing partner of my law firm summoned me into his corner office. He was a stern, conservative man who absolutely despised scandal. Resting on the center of his massive mahogany desk was a formal, heavily expedited complaint submitted anonymously to the State Ethical Review Board. The document accused me of executing an illegal, unauthorized cyber intrusion into the secure corporate databases of Vail Meridian Logistics in order to execute a personal vendetta against an executive. The complaint demanded my immediate suspension and an inquiry into my license to practice law. Meredith was attempting to decapitate me professionally. She wanted to strip away my credentials, ensuring that if I ever tried to bring my evidence to the authorities or the press, I would do so as a disgraced, disbarred, and entirely discredited ex-wife. But I had anticipated the strike. I had spent my entire career anticipating the defensive maneuvers of guilty corporations. I calmly opened my leather briefcase and handed my managing partner a thick-bound dossier. I did not hack into any protected corporate mainframe. I explained the irrefutable legal doctrine of shared marital property. Every single byte of data, every photograph, and every financial discrepancy had been lawfully extracted from a communal marital device left unsecured in my own primary residence. I provided the sworn, notarized affidavits from Miles Avery, detailing a flawless, unbreakable chain of custody. There were no illegal wiretaps, no unauthorized firewall breaches, just a wife looking at a phone her husband used to pay their shared utility bills. The managing partner read through the affidavits, his tense shoulders slowly relaxing. The complaint was fundamentally toothless, a scare tactic built on bluffing. He dismissed the inquiry, but the ambient temperature in the room remained dangerously low. The message had been delivered and received. I returned to my office and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the busy downtown avenue. Parked directly across the street, occupying a commercial loading zone, was a heavy black town car with heavily tinted windows. It had been sitting there since I arrived at 7:30 in the morning. For 4 straight hours, the engine simply idled. No one opened the doors. No one stepped out onto the pavement. The vehicle just sat there, a silent, looming block of intimidation. It was a tactic straight out of a private intelligence playbook. The goal was not physical harm. The goal was psychological erosion. Meredith wanted me to look out my window and remember that she had the capital to place eyes on me at all times. She wanted me to feel the crushing, suffocating weight of her resources. She did not need people to love her or respect her. She only needed them to be absolutely terrified of the cost of standing in her way. Most people would have closed the blinds. Most people would have felt the cold grip of panic tightening around their throats, reconsidered the lucrative settlement offer, and quietly signed the non-disclosure agreement. I did not close the blinds. I stood at the glass and stared directly at the tinted windshield of the idling sedan, allowing the cold, analytical part of my brain to completely take over. Panic is a useless, chaotic emotion. Structure is how you win wars. I immediately implemented a catastrophic fail-safe protocol. I contacted Miles and Joanna, instructing them to sever all direct digital communication with my primary devices. I took the master hard drive containing the entirety of the Vale Meridian corruption files and fragmented the data. I divided the evidence into 3 distinct, encrypted partitions. I placed the first physical drive in a secure safety deposit box under a newly formed limited liability company. I handed the second drive to an independent, highly trusted colleague, holding it under strict attorney-client privilege. I uploaded the third partition to a dead man's switch server hosted in a foreign jurisdiction, programmed to automatically release the files to 20 major news outlets if I failed to manually reset the timer every 48 hours. From that exact second forward, Meredith Vale lost the ability to contain the blast radius. It no longer mattered if she intimidated me, fired me, or managed to somehow completely silence me. The truth was no longer tied to my physical presence. It was autonomous. Looking down at the dark, idling car, I felt a profound, absolute shift in my own internal gravity. The raw, bleeding pain of a ruined marriage had fully cauterized. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a shared bank account or a broken vow. It was a methodical, high-stakes campaign to surgically dissect a legacy that believed itself to be completely immune to consequences. The true retaliation had officially begun. There is a specific, hollow kind of agony in discovering that the people who share your blood are more terrified of your righteous anger than they are of the person who destroyed your life. I invited my mother and my older brother, Declan, to my home on a Sunday afternoon. I poured coffee. I sat them down at the same dining table where I had recently ended my marriage, and I laid out the bare, undeniable facts of Nolan's betrayal and Meredith's extortion ring. I expected outrage. I expected my family to rally around me, to offer the kind of fierce, unconditional protection we had always promised one another since our father passed away. Instead, I got fear. Declan did not defend my husband. He called Nolan a coward and a fool, but as my brother paced the length of my living room, his hands running frantically through his hair, his anxiety was not directed at the man who had broken my heart. It was directed entirely at me. Declan owned a mid-sized freight hauling company on the edge of the city. He had spent 10 grueling years building it from a single rusted rig into a profitable enterprise. But his entire operational lifeline was tethered to the massive, sprawling ecosystem of Vale Meridian. They were his primary contractor. He stopped pacing and looked at me with eyes full of sheer panic. He begged me not to strike a match and burn down the entire city just because my own house was already on fire. He explained that a public corporate scandal of this magnitude would trigger immediate vendor freezes. Accounts would be suspended pending federal review. The resulting shockwave would absolutely obliterate his contracts, bankrupt his small company, and put 40 of his drivers out of work in a matter of weeks. He was asking me to swallow the poison so his business could survive. My mother sat rigidly on the sofa. her hands folded tightly in her lap. She belonged to a generation of women who believed that survival lay in graceful silence. She leaned forward, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper, and told me that the public would never punish the powerful woman who stole my husband. They would only scrutinize the wife who could not keep him. She pleaded with me to take a quiet divorce, secure a generous financial settlement, and walk away with my dignity intact. To her, dignity meant avoiding the messy, humiliating theater of a public war. Sitting in my own living room, surrounded by the only family I had left, I felt a crushing, absolute isolation that made the initial discovery of the hotel photograph feel like a minor inconvenience. The betrayal of a cheating spouse is a sharp, sudden amputation. But watching the people who love you beg you to shrink yourself, to endure injustice quietly, so they do not have to feel the uncomfortable ripples of your fight, is a slow, suffocating poison. By Tuesday evening, the exhaustion had finally seeped into my bones. The sheer, overwhelming weight of fighting a billionaire executive, managing a divorce, and now carrying the guilt of potentially ruining my brother's livelihood was breaking my resolve. I sat at my desk, staring blindly at a drafted petition for a standard, uncontested divorce. I was dangerously close to surrendering. I was minutes away from signing the paperwork, taking my half of the assets, and letting Meredith Vale completely get away with it. Then, my secure phone vibrated. It was a text message from Tessa Rowan, the executive assistant who had reached out anonymously days prior. The message contained an address for a dilapidated 24-hour diner located just off the interstate, far outside the city limits, and a time, 11:45 at night. I drove through the freezing rain, pulling into a parking lot illuminated by a single flickering neon sign. The diner smelled intensely of old grease and stale coffee. Tessa was sitting in a booth at the very back, half hidden in the shadows, nursing a mug of dark water that loosely resembled tea. When I slid into the vinyl seat across from her, she did not smile or offer a greeting. She simply reached into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, tightly packed manila envelope, sliding it across the sticky Formica table. I opened the metal clasp and pulled out a stack of heavily redacted documents. Tessa had brought me the Holy Grail. The first few pages were printed copies of Meredith's official digital calendar, completely unscrubbed. The dates matched Maren Collier's timeline, Elise Farrow's timeline, and Nolan's timeline flawlessly. Next were internal expense reports, specifically coding those illicit weekend hotel stays under a brilliantly vague category labeled as Executive Leadership Retreat Development. Tessa had also included the blank, standardized severance agreements that the legal department kept on file, specifically drafted to quietly execute the careers of the men Meredith discarded once they had signed the fraudulent vendor approvals. But the final document in the stack was the one that stopped the blood in my veins. It was a highly classified, internal financial ledger detailing the corporate distribution of discretionary funds. I traced the columns with my index finger, deciphering the complex accounting matrix. Millions of dollars allocated for emergency legal retainers, non-disclosure payouts, and consulting resolutions for former executives were not being paid out of the primary corporate logistics accounts. They were being meticulously funneled directly through the Vale Legacy Foundation, the charitable organization, the philanthropic crown jewel of the Vale family, widely praised in every single regional newspaper for its generous contributions to underprivileged youth and community development. Meredith was utilizing a tax-exempt charity as a shadow bank to finance her extortion ring and buy the silence of her victims. I looked up at Tessa, my mind racing to process the sheer, staggering audacity of the crime. Tessa leaned across the table, her voice barely louder than the hum of the diner's ancient refrigerator. She informed me that in exactly 2 weeks, Vale Meridian Logistics was hosting its monumental 50th anniversary gala at the most exclusive museum venue in the city. The event would be packed with state senators, major investors, and national media outlets. But it was not just an anniversary party. Tessa revealed that behind closed doors, the board of directors had already finalized the paperwork. At the climax of the gala, the current patriarch of the company would step down, and Meredith Vale would be officially crowned as the new chief executive officer. Furthermore, the Vale Legacy Foundation's flagship educational grant was scheduled to be publicly rebranded that exact same night. It would be formally christened as the Meredith Vale Leadership Endowment. The sheer narcissism of it all was breathtaking. She was going to stand in front of the entire city, wearing a designer gown, and accept a philanthropic honor funded entirely by the blood money of the people she had blackmailed. At that precise second, staring at the fluorescent lights reflecting off the linoleum table, the final remnants of my hesitation vanished. My brother's fear and my mother's desperate plea for quiet dignity evaporated into the cold, damp air. I saw the fatal, gaping flaw in Meredith's impenetrable armor. Her entire existence, her vast power, and her shield of invincibility were entirely dependent on the pristine, untouchable image of the noble corporate heir. She did not just want power, she desperately needed the public reverence that came with her family name. If you want to kill a monster who feeds on prestige, you cannot simply stab them in the dark. You cannot bleed them out in a quiet, confidential arbitration room where their high-priced lawyers can easily mop up the mess and seal the records. If she lived for the legacy, then the fatal blow had to be delivered at the exact moment that legacy was being exalted. The destruction had to be completely public, undeniably documented, and impossible to spin. I slid the documents back into the manila envelope and tucked it securely under my arm. I thanked Tessa, left a $20 bill on the table for the coffee we never drank, and walked out into the freezing rain. I was no longer an angry wife looking to expose a petty, sordid affair. I was the architect of a demolition. I was going to sever the deeply entrenched veins connecting the corporate power, the fraudulent charity, the prestigious family name, and the predatory hunting model Meredith had perfected over the last decade. And I was going to do it precisely when the spotlight was shining brightest on her face. The back room of the small, independent coffee shop on the edge of the financial district smelled heavily of roasted beans and stale rain. I had reserved the space under a fake name, ensuring we had absolute privacy. When I walked in, Marin Collier and Elise Farrow were already seated at the scarred wooden table. They sat as far apart as possible, their body language screaming discomfort. They were women who had been paid to disappear, and now I was dragging them back into the harsh light. 10 minutes later, the final piece of the puzzle arrived. His name was Gavin Holt. 5 years ago, he had been the absolute crown jewel of the Vale Leadership Fellowship, a brilliant logistics analyst destined for the executive suite. Now, he looked like a man who had not slept a full night in half a decade. His shoulders were permanently hunched, his eyes darting toward the door as if he expected corporate security to burst through at any second. I locked the heavy wooden door behind him. The time for polite, sympathetic murmurs was completely over. "We are not here to share our feelings," I told the three of them, pulling a thick stack of legal pads and manila folders from my briefcase. "We are here to build a timeline. Every single piece of paper, every digital artifact you have been hiding out of fear, goes on this table right now." Marin was the first to break the tension. She reached into her leather purse and slammed a thick binder of printed text messages onto the wood. She had kept them hidden in a safe deposit box for years. The language in the texts was a terrifying masterclass in coercive control. Meredith did not write like a passionate lover. She wrote like a warden. The messages seamlessly blended aggressive sexual demands with rigid corporate commands. "Be in the suite at 8 o'clock. Bring the finalized vendor approvals. Do not make me wait." Elise wordlessly pushed a heavily redacted envelope across the table. It contained the highly classified separation agreement her ex-husband had been violently coerced into signing. But Elise had something far more valuable than a standard non-disclosure agreement. She had the bank routing numbers. She showed me the exact financial trail where her husband's severance package, officially labeled as a career transition consulting fee, had been wired directly from a heavily shielded shell company, entirely bypassing the primary corporate accounting department. Then, Gavin finally spoke. His voice was a dry, broken rasp. He reached into his coat pocket and placed a small, outdated digital audio recorder on the table. He explained that during his final, disastrous hotel meeting with Meredith, when he had frantically tried to refuse signing a blatantly illegal safety waiver for a preferred logistics vendor, he had managed to hit record on his device. He pressed the play button. The audio was scratchy, filled with the ambient noise of a luxury hotel suite, but Meredith's voice cut through the static with absolute, chilling clarity. "You are deeply confused about how power works. Gavin," her recorded voice purred, dripping with lethal condescension. "You think you earn it with hard work? You do not. You earn it with leverage. True loyalty only begins when someone has something to lose. Sign the waiver, or I forward this entire hotel itinerary to your pregnant wife." The recording clicked off. The silence in the coffee shop room was deafening. I did not let the heavy, suffocating weight of their shared trauma paralyze the room. I immediately shifted into the mode of a lead prosecutor preparing for a massive grand jury indictment. I used a red marker to draw a massive grid on the whiteboard hanging on the back wall. I forced them to detach from their shame. For 3 grueling hours, we cross-referenced Marin's dates with Elise's financial routing numbers and Gavin's audio file. We mapped the exact, repeating life cycle of Meredith's predatory ecosystem. By the time we finished, the scattered, deeply humiliating tragedies of 3 separate families had metamorphosed into a singular, undeniable, and utterly devastating legal dossier. When they finally looked at the whiteboard, the heavy cloaks of shame they had worn for years visibly lifted from their shoulders. They realized they were not isolated fools who had failed to save their marriages. They were the surviving casualties of a highly organized, heavily funded corporate syndicate. They were no longer victims. They were my star witnesses. But witnesses and documents are completely useless without the proper delivery mechanisms. I needed a massive public megaphone, and I needed an executioner operating inside the corporate walls. I spent the next 48 hours cultivating 2 highly strategic, independent targets. First, I reached out to Ivy Mercer. Ivy was a notoriously aggressive investigative journalist for a major financial publication, a woman who had built an entire, formidable career out of dismantling corrupt corporate executives. I did not give her the full narrative. I gave her a blind drop containing Elise's shell company routing numbers and a brief summary of the manipulated vendor contracts. It was just enough raw meat to make a predator hungry. Ivy took the bait instantly, launching her own independent inquiry into the corporate logistics network. My second target was Conrad Ellis. Conrad was a brilliant, fiercely independent attorney who had recently been retained by a small, anxious faction of the Vale Meridian Board of Directors to conduct a routine governance and risk management review. He was looking for standard corporate inefficiencies. I sent a heavily redacted, anonymous courier package directly to his private office. The package contained Gavin's audio transcript and a single typed note suggesting he look very closely at the rapid, unexplained executive turnover within the acclaimed mentorship fellowship. I gave Conrad the exact thread he needed to pull to unravel the entire sweater. The trap was flawlessly set, but I needed a final catalyst to accelerate the timeline. That catalyst arrived on a Friday afternoon in the form of a hysterical phone call from my estranged husband. When I answered the line, Nolan was hyperventilating so severely he could barely form a coherent sentence. His arrogant corporate facade had been entirely vaporized. The internal legal department at Vale Meridian had suddenly ambushed him. They had locked him out of his primary workstation, confiscated his company devices, and dragged him into a windowless conference room. They had presented him with a terrifying preliminary brief that painted him as a completely rogue, isolated actor. They were systematically preparing to make him the sole, sacrificial scapegoat for the entire chain of anomalous contracting approvals. Meredith was officially throwing him to the wolves. "They are going to completely destroy me, Camilla," Nolan sobbed through the phone. "She is making it look like I orchestrated the entire fraud to line my own pockets." I felt absolutely no pity for the man weeping on the other end of the line. I did not offer him forgiveness, and I did not offer him comfort. I offered him a transaction. "You are currently drowning," I told him, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And I am holding the only life preserver. If you want any chance of surviving the impending federal indictments, you are going to stop crying and start working." I demanded total, unconditional surrender. I required him to immediately hand over every single piece of communication he had secretly hoarded. I wanted the hidden signature routing protocols. I wanted the off-system directives Meredith had verbally issued and he had frantically jotted down in his personal notebooks. I wanted the exact, undeniable proof that he was operating under direct coercive orders from the chief operating officer. Nolan agreed to everything. His sheer, blinding terror of going to federal prison easily eclipsed his fear of Meredith Vale. As I disconnected the call, a profound, icy calm settled over me. The board was perfectly arranged. For the first time in her incredibly privileged, destructive life, Meredith Vale was no longer facing down an insulted, grieving wife she could easily dismiss or buy off. She was entirely surrounded. She was trapped inside a tightening, invisible net of coordinated witnesses, irrefutable financial documents, an approaching investigative journalist, and an internal board attorney who was actively hunting her. And the most beautiful, terrifying part of it all was that she still believed she was completely untouchable. The week of the 50th anniversary gala arrived, and the presence of Meredith Vale was absolutely inescapable. If you walked past a downtown newsstand, her perfectly contoured face stared back from the glossy covers of 3 different regional business magazines. The bold, adoring headlines heralded her as a visionary successor, a tireless champion of educational philanthropy, and the brilliant, uncompromising architect of a modern logistics restructuring. She spent her mornings executing flawless television interviews, smiling serenely as she discussed female empowerment and corporate responsibility with fawning hosts. She was a towering monument, casting a long, immaculate shadow over the entire city. Deep underneath that blinding spotlight, my team was quietly cataloging the corpses. Joanna finally cracked the ultimate layer of the financial labyrinth. She successfully identified the exact, heavily guarded routing node, a deeply buried shell corporation registered in Delaware under the name North Ledger Advisory. This was the specific black box where the charitable funds drained from the foundation were diverted, thoroughly scrubbed, and completely separated from their origin. Joanna found the secondary ledgers showing how the stolen charity capital was categorically reclassified to pass standard audits. The hush money, the punitive severance packages, and the quiet settlements were sterilely coded in the accounting software as human resources resolution disbursements and brand protection consulting fees. It was a highly sophisticated money laundering operation perfectly disguised as standard corporate governance. Simultaneously, Nolan made good on his desperate, pathetic promise to save himself. He dumped the entirety of his hidden personal correspondence onto my secure server. I spent an entire night reviewing the digital cache, finding the exact smoking guns the internal corporate auditors had completely missed. There were dozens of encrypted emails where Meredith explicitly ordered him to migrate highly sensitive vendor approvals off the monitored internal network and onto private, untraceable communication channels. I found the exact time-stamped directives, commanding him to manually alter the performance scorecards for her preferred subcontractors hours after the official bidding windows had permanently closed. But the most disturbing piece of intelligence did not come from my forensic accountant or my estranged husband. It came directly from the center of the empire. During a brief, highly encrypted phone call, Tessa revealed a layer of psychological darkness that went far beyond simple, transactional blackmail. Meredith did not just use the affair material to force signatures, she hoarded it like a dragon guarding gold. Tessa had discovered a highly restricted, heavily encrypted local drive hidden deep within Meredith's primary office workstation. It was a digital trophy room. She kept meticulous, categorized folders containing the saved text messages, the intimate photographs, and the detailed hotel itineraries of every single former fellow she had ever compromised over the last decade. It was a reverse insurance policy, a permanent, terrifying archive of leverage designed to guarantee their absolute silence for the rest of their natural lives, long after they had been exiled from the company payroll. The sheer, crushing scale of the operation was terrifying, and the immense pressure was beginning to fracture the weaker links in my chain. On Wednesday morning, one of my key witnesses nearly broke. A private courier arrived at their quiet suburban home, delivering a heavily veiled, highly aggressive cease and desist letter from the premier outside counsel retained by the logistics firm. The legal threat promised total, inescapable financial ruin if they ever violated the terms of their non-disclosure agreements. Panic set in immediately. I received a frantic, breathless phone call from the witness, begging to withdraw their sworn affidavit and disappear back into the comfortable shadows of anonymity. I did not panic, and I did not attempt to offer empty emotional reassurance. I had designed this entire demolition based on a fundamental principle of structural engineering. You never allow a single load-bearing pillar to carry the entire weight of the roof. If one witness cracked, the building would not fall, because I had engineered massive redundancy into the blueprint. I took the massive, compiled dossier of evidence and deliberately fractured it into three highly specific, completely independent branches. The first branch was hand-delivered to Ivy Mercer, the investigative journalist. I gave her the unredacted financial pathways linking the highly praised charity to North Ledger Advisory, providing the exact, undeniable proof of the money laundering and the settlement payoffs. The second branch was routed directly to Conrad Ellis, the independent board attorney. I supplied him with Nolan's explicit emails regarding the off-system approvals and the altered contractor scorecards. This provided him with the undeniable proof of systemic fiduciary failure absolutely required to trigger an emergency executive suspension. The third branch was a masterpiece of legal misdirection. I drafted a massive, anonymous whistleblower complaint and submitted it to a completely fabricated entity I named the Commonwealth Contract Integrity Bureau. I used official-looking state watermarks, complex bureaucratic language, and routed the physical mailing from a post office box in the state capitol. I addressed copies to the entire internal legal department of the logistics firm. While the bureau itself was entirely fictitious, the internal panic it would generate was very real. Corporate lawyers are programmed to react to the mere whisper of state-level oversight by immediately freezing all operations and quarantining the executives involved to prevent evidence spoliation. The true, terrifying lethality of this tripartite strategy lay entirely in its synchronization. I coordinated the detonation sequence with absolute, uncompromising precision. Ivy's explosive exposé, Conrad's emergency board governance warning, and the arrival of the terrifying state-level complaint were all scheduled to hit their respective targets on the exact same afternoon. They were timed to detonate precisely when Meredith stood before a crowd of 1,000 people to receive her halo. Meredith, existing in a state of supreme, unchallenged arrogance, was entirely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath her feet had already dissolved into ash. Her hubris was so monumental that she had actually orchestrated a final, public humiliation for my husband. Nolan informed me that she had explicitly mandated his attendance at the anniversary gala. Furthermore, she had deliberately assigned him a seat in the absolute first row of the grand ballroom. It was a terrifyingly clear public message to him and to anyone else who suspected the truth. She wanted to look down from the podium and see the broken pawn she had commanded, proving to herself that she still possessed total control over the men who had occupied her bed. On Thursday evening, exactly 24 hours before the event, a small, heavy envelope arrived at my office via a private courier. I opened it to find a single, gold-embossed VIP entry ticket to the gala. There was no note attached, but I knew exactly who had sent it. Tessa had ensured I had full, unquestioned clearance to walk through the front doors. I placed the heavy cardstock on my desk and smoothed my hand over the elegant typography. I was not going to attend this event as a weeping, betrayed wife desperate for a chaotic public confrontation. I was not going to throw a drink or scream her name across a crowded ballroom. I was going to enter that room as a completely calm, invisible shadow. I was simply going to take a quiet seat in the back, blend into the sea of expensive evening gowns, and watch a towering, corrupt monument collapse entirely by the weight of its own rotten foundation. The traps were completely set. The witnesses were locked into place. The documents were loaded in the chamber. Everything was utterly, perfectly ready. The only variable remaining in the equation was whether Meredith Vale possessed the survival instinct to smell the thick, choking smoke before the fire finally touched her name. The most dangerous phase of any controlled demolition is not the planning, nor is it the final collapse. It is the suffocating, silent vacuum of time that exists immediately after the fuses have been lit, but right before the structural charges actually detonate. It is the agonizing stretch of hours where a single miscalculation, a sudden loss of nerve, or one intercepted phone call can completely reverse the trajectory of the strike. Exactly 4 hours before the grand doors of the anniversary gala were scheduled to open, the retaliatory shockwaves began to ripple through my carefully constructed network. Meredith Vale was entirely unaware of the massive snare closing around her throat, but her highly paid corporate defense attorneys were remarkably instinctual predators. They smelled a shift in the wind. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, aggressive, heavily formalized cease and desist letters were hand-delivered by private couriers to Marin, Elise, and Gavin. The legal documents did not address the truth of the allegations. Instead, they demanded an immediate halt to the dissemination of maliciously fabricated information and explicitly threatened devastating, multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuits against anyone who dared to speak publicly about the internal operations of the logistics firm. The sheer, overwhelming force of the legal threat was designed to induce absolute paralysis. It nearly worked. I knew that several senior members of the board of directors still harbored a deep, unwavering loyalty to the Vale family name. If even one of my witnesses recanted out of sheer terror, the board would instantly seize the opportunity to completely reframe the impending disaster. They would weaponize my own marriage against me, spinning the entire mountain of evidence into a pathetic, hysterical domestic drama manufactured by a bitter, scorned wife. That terrifying possibility nearly became a reality at exactly 3 o'clock. Dana Loeb, a highly critical former human resources manager who had personally processed the fraudulent severance packages for the discarded executives, suddenly went completely dark. I had placed her in a secure, anonymous hotel room on the outskirts of the city to ensure she could not be intimidated, but when I attempted to check in with her, the call went straight to a disconnected voicemail. I contacted the front desk, only to be informed that she had hastily checked out of her room 45 minutes prior, leaving absolutely no forwarding information. The secure group chat linking my remaining witnesses instantly erupted into a frantic, spiraling panic. They saw Dana's sudden disappearance as a glaring signal that the Vale legal machine was already hunting them down one by one. They were teetering on the absolute edge of a mass defection. I did not allow the panic to infect my own nervous system. I simply closed my eyes, took a slow, measured breath, and let the cold logic of my legal training override the rising tide of adrenaline. Dana's physical absence was a minor, irrelevant variable, because I never trusted human courage to hold up under the crushing weight of corporate intimidation. I had anticipated this exact fracture. I did not need Dana to be brave tonight. I only needed what she had already given me yesterday. 24 hours prior, I had forced her to sit in front of a licensed notary public and physically sign a watertight, legally binding affidavit detailing every single illegal payout she had facilitated. That heavily stamped document was already safely locked inside an encrypted server, programmed to automatically deliver itself directly into the private inbox of Conrad Ellis, the independent board attorney, via an unalterable scheduled transmission. Dana could run to the other side of the planet for all I cared. Her ink was already permanently stained on the record, but a far more critical structural failure occurred at 5 o'clock. My phone vibrated with a direct call from Nolan. He was already inside the luxury hotel hosting the gala, getting dressed in his tailored tuxedo. His voice was a thin, trembling wire of pure desperation. The internal legal department had just ambushed him in his hotel suite. They had placed a pristine, flawless golden parachute on the table right in front of him. It was a completely clean severance package. They promised him full corporate indemnification, a staggering financial reimbursement, and a quiet, highly respectable exit from the logistics industry. There was only one condition. He had to sign a formal confession stating that he had acted entirely as a rogue, isolated individual, absorbing 100% of the liability for the manipulated vendor contracts and the bypassed compliance protocols. He was breaking. The sheer, blinding terror of federal prison was warring with the intoxicating promise of a clean escape. He was practically begging me for permission to take the deal, foolishly believing that Meredith was actually extending him a genuine lifeline. I did not waste time arguing with him over the phone. I grabbed my coat, left my office, and drove my car straight into the heart of the downtown financial district. I met him in the sprawling, opulent lobby of the gala venue. The space was already teeming with event coordinators and security personnel setting up the velvet ropes. Nolan looked physically ill. His skin was pale, his hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive trousers, and his eyes darted nervously around the massive marble columns. I walked directly up to him, bypassing any form of greeting. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out a single, heavily folded sheet of paper. It was the internal crisis management memo Tessa had covertly leaked to me just 48 hours ago. I forced it into his shaking hands. "Read it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. Nolan stared down at the document. It was Meredith's meticulously detailed contingency plan. It explicitly outlined the exact strategy to legally isolate him, brand him as a lone, disgruntled saboteur, and subsequently turn him over directly to federal prosecutors the moment his signature was secured on the confession. The severance package was not a lifeline. It was a legally binding suicide note. I watched the final, pathetic illusion of his corporate romance completely shatter behind his eyes. He finally understood that he was nothing more than an expendable piece of meat being tossed into the gears of the machine to keep Meredith's pristine legacy completely spotless. Nolan did not argue anymore. He pulled a silver pen from his jacket pocket and immediately signed the supplemental affidavit I had drafted, completely waiving his right to any corporate defense. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached into his pocket and handed me a small digital flash drive. "She left a voice memo on my secure line 2 months ago," he whispered, his voice completely hollowed out. "I saved it. I do not know why, but I saved it." I plugged the drive into my phone and pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. It was Meredith, her tone dripping with absolute arrogant invincibility. "You worry entirely too much, Nolan," her recorded voice purred through the small speaker. "Married men never blow up their own homes. That is why they are safe. You will sign the contract, and you will go home to your lovely wife, and everything will remain perfectly intact." It was the final, devastating nail in her heavily gilded coffin. At exactly 6 o'clock, Ivy Mercer sent me a highly encrypted text message. She had detected the aggressive movements of the Vail legal team attempting to secure emergency injunctions to kill any negative press. Recognizing the severe, imminent risk of her investigation being legally suffocated in the dark, Ivy made a ruthless editorial decision. She bypassed her standard morning publication slot and pushed the massive, highly detailed investigative article to the live servers 2 full hours earlier than our original schedule. By 7 o'clock, I was standing inside the grand ballroom. I had utilized the VIP ticket Tessa provided to bypass the massive security perimeter. The room was a breathtaking monument to generational wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over hundreds of guests dressed in silk and velvet. Waiters in pristine white coats circulated with silver trays of expensive champagne. Hanging directly above the main stage was a massive, glowing banner proudly displaying the newly minted title, the Meredith Vail Legacy Initiative. I did not mingle. I did not accept a glass of champagne. I retreated to a dark, quiet alcove near the heavy oak doors at the back of the room, leaning my shoulder against a cold marble pillar. Meredith was standing near the front of the room, completely surrounded by a thick crowd of adoring politicians and wealthy investors. She looked absolutely radiant, a flawless vision of corporate royalty entirely convinced of her own absolute supremacy. Then, the shift happened. It was not a loud explosion. It was a subtle, terrifying change in the atmospheric pressure of the room. A single phone buzzed in the pocket of a board member standing near the bar. Then, 3 more phones vibrated simultaneously. Within 60 seconds, a low collective murmur began to sweep through the glittering crowd. People stopped drinking. They lowered their crystal glasses and stared down at the glowing screens of their devices. The news alerts were hitting their inboxes like a relentless barrage of artillery fire. Ivy's article had dropped, carrying the explosive headlines of systemic extortion, heavily manipulated logistics contracts, and the blatant laundering of charitable funds. Simultaneously, the emergency governance warnings triggered by Conrad Ellis were flooding the private servers of every single executive in the room. I watched the exact moment the devastating shockwave finally reached the front of the room. The sycophantic crowd surrounding Meredith suddenly parted, physically stepping away from her as if she had instantly contracted a lethal, highly contagious disease. She stood there, completely isolated under the massive, mocking banner of her own legacy, her perfect smile freezing into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion as the chairman of the board bypassed her entirely and began marching toward the stage with a grim, pale face. I did not step forward, I did not shout her name, and I did not demand the petty satisfaction of making sure she saw my face in the crowd. The most beautiful, flawless revenge sometimes has absolutely nothing to do with throwing a devastating insult or staging a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes, the ultimate retribution is simply possessing the absolute discipline to stand completely still in the shadows and quietly watch the precise, inescapable timing do all the brutal work for you. The applause that filled the grand ballroom was deafening. It was the sound of absolute, unquestioning worship. From my vantage point in the deep shadows near the heavy oak doors, I watched Meredith Vale ascend the softly lit steps of the main stage. She moved with the fluid, effortless grace of a monarch stepping up to her rightful throne. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald gown, her posture radiating an intoxicating blend of power and rehearsed humility. Tonight was the culmination of her entire existence. In less than 3 minutes, the current patriarch would officially name her as the new chief executive officer, and the massive, glowing banners suspended above her would formally declare the renaming of the charity to the Meredith Vale Legacy Initiative. She reached the podium, resting her manicured hands lightly on the polished wood. She flashed a brilliant, practiced smile, waiting for the standing ovation to naturally subside. But the silence that followed was not the quiet anticipation of an eager audience. It was a sudden, jarring fracture. Before Meredith could utter her opening syllable, the heavy velvet curtains beside the stage abruptly parted. The chairman of the board of directors emerged, his face entirely drained of color, his expression rigid and grim. Flanking his right side was Conrad Ellis, the independent corporate attorney. They did not wait for an introduction. They bypassed the ceremonial protocol entirely, marching directly across the stage toward her. The audience murmured, a low hum of genuine confusion rippling through the sea of expensive tuxedos and evening gowns. Meredith's perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She leaned away slightly as the chairman stopped inches from the microphone. He did not look her in the eye. Instead, Conrad Ellis stepped forward and placed a thick, sealed legal document directly onto the podium, covering her prepared speech. Conrad's voice was unamplified, but in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the massive room, it carried with lethal clarity. He informed her that, effective immediately, her executive authority was completely suspended. She was formally barred from all corporate premises, pending an emergency, independent federal investigation into gross abuses of power, severe oversight violations, and systemic financial fraud. At that exact, synchronized second, the digital delayed fuses I had planted completely detonated. Every single mobile device in the grand ballroom seemed to vibrate simultaneously. The heavy gold-plated donors, the senior directors, and the elite political guests looked down at their screens. Ivy Mercer's investigative bombshell had just bypassed the corporate firewalls and flooded their inboxes. The guests began reading the meticulously documented history of a 9-year predatory regime. They read about the weaponization of sexual relationships, the heavily altered operational contracts, the 6-figure hush money payouts, and the sickening reality that the esteemed family charity had been functioning as a private laundering facility to clean up the wreckage of ruined men. I watched the realization wash over the glittering crowd. The people who had paid tens of thousands of dollars a plate to honor the Veil name suddenly understood that the magnificent legacy they were celebrating was nothing more than a thin layer of luxurious paint coating a massive, highly organized extortion ring. The reverence in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a toxic, palpable revulsion. Panic finally cracked Meredith's flawless facade. Her survival instinct, honed by years of unchecked dominance, flared violently. She grabbed the microphone, her voice shrill and desperate, completely abandoning her polished persona. She attempted to immediately execute the exact contingency plan she had laid out in her leaked memo. She shouted into the silent room, claiming that this was nothing more than a vicious, fabricated smear campaign orchestrated by a deeply unstable, bitter wife attempting to destroy her over a petty domestic dispute. She tried to reduce the sprawling federal crimes into a pathetic narrative of female jealousy, but that frantic, desperate defense died the second it left her throat. Conrad Ellis simply opened his leather briefcase. He did not argue with her. He let the paper trail speak. He extracted the notarized affidavits from Marin, Elise, and Dana, placing them heavily on the podium. He laid out the corresponding, time-stamped hotel receipts, the digital directives explicitly commanding the alteration of vendor bidding files, and the offshore routing numbers linking the foundation directly to the non-disclosure payouts. Then, the final, crushing blow was delivered entirely off-stage. Through the side entrance of the ballroom, 2 stern corporate security officers escorted Nolan out of the venue. He was not wearing handcuffs, but he looked entirely hollowed out, his head bowed, his shoulders completely defeated. He was being escorted to a secure, private conference room to serve as the primary cooperating witness for the federal investigators already waiting upstairs. In that single, humiliating march across the periphery of the room, my estranged husband ceased to be the ambitious, chosen man he believed himself to be. He was completely reduced to a living, breathing piece of forensic evidence, a walking testament to how Meredith Vale selected, utilized, and casually discarded human beings. The chairman returned to the microphone. His voice trembled slightly as he addressed the horrified donors and investors. He announced that the board had just concluded an emergency vote. The executive succession was permanently canceled. The assets of the family foundation were immediately frozen under federal mandate. All marketing projects, scholarship rebrandings, and public initiatives bearing the name Meredith Vale were to be instantly dismantled and placed under severe external review. I stood motionless in the shadows, watching the brutal, absolute dismantling of her empire. The cruelest, most agonizing punishment for a woman like Meredith was not the immediate loss of her exorbitant salary or the looming threat of a white-collar prison sentence. The true, agonizing death was watching the one thing she valued above all human life, the immaculate, historical image she had ruthlessly bled people to build, violently ripped from her grasp exactly 3 minutes before it was meant to be permanently engraved in stone. She was stripped of her mythology in front of the exact audience she desperately wanted to worship her. Several months passed before the dust finally settled over the smoldering crater of Vale Meridian Logistics. I finalized my divorce in a remarkably quiet, empty courtroom on a Tuesday morning, because Nolan had completely waived his rights to a defense. I secured a heavily favored, uncompromising division of our marital assets. I kept the brownstone, the primary investment accounts, and every single dollar of the retirement funds he had not managed to siphon into his illicit shadow portfolio. Meredith, conversely, plunged into an absolute abyss of litigation, She was entirely consumed by a massive wave of civil lawsuits from the contractors she had defrauded and the former executives she had extorted. The state regulatory boards launched a sprawling, multi-year investigation into the logistics bidding contracts, effectively blacklisting the entire parent corporation from future government work. Her name, once synonymous with visionary leadership, became a toxic, radioactive liability. She faced a vast, terrifying public void that absolutely no amount of hoarded wealth could ever buy her way out of. But the true resolution of this story did not happen in a courtroom months later. It happened on that exact night, outside the gala. After the chairman finished speaking, while the panicked guests began flooding toward the coat checks and Meredith was cornered by internal investigators on the stage, I quietly turned around and pushed open the heavy oak doors. I walked out of the opulent venue and stepped into the freezing, sharp air of the city night. The street was quiet. My encrypted phone, resting deeply in my coat pocket, was completely silent. There were no more panicked text messages, no more hidden banking alerts, and no more agonizing, late-night discoveries. I pulled my collar up against the cold wind and began to walk down the empty pavement. I felt a profound, deep settling in my bones. I realized, with absolute clarity, that I had not survived this nightmare by screaming the loudest. I had not won by proving I was the most deeply wounded, and I certainly had not won by descending into chaotic, emotional cruelty. I won because I possessed the sheer, unbreakable discipline to remain perfectly calm. I won because I knew how to take the raw, bleeding agony of betrayal, strip away the noise, and forge the cold, hard truth into a scalpel. And I waited, patiently in the dark, until I could slide that blade into the exact, singular vulnerability that could permanently kill a legacy. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.